Hi everyone. I wanted to hop on here and once again go over some helpful tips and advice I have for the two assignments that we have coming up, both the research article analysis and discussion as well as the final paper. Just because I've had some conversation with students, and I want to make sure that there's no confusion. I know when it comes to an online course, we don't get the typical possibilities and opportunities for interaction that we would have in a face-to-face or in the hybrid courses. So what I try to do is learn from the conversations I have with other students in case other people might have those same questions. So for this first one coming up, the video, it is imperative that you go and into Blackboard onto the assignments resource folder and watch my video on the library database. That is how you ensure that you are choosing an article that works for that assignment, as well as articles for your paper in terms of like resources, to make sure that you're meeting the criteria of having at least 5 academic journal articles as your sources. But for this first assignment, because I had some students bring in some articles that are asking me about some potential articles. They had like a list of 5 of them or so, maybe a little bit more. But there were some that were from like Time Magazine. I think there was one from like the New York Times, and those are articles, but those are print publications. Those are different than academic peer reviewed journal articles. So if you watch the video that I posted on Blackboard in the assignments resources folder, I show you how to get to EBSCO, which is a huge academic online database where you can look through a bunch of journals. And then I show you, once you click and search your keywords, the 2 boxes you need to check to make sure you're choosing something that is, you're getting the full text, so you have access to the full text to download and read. And the second box you're checking is one that says it is scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles. So make sure you're doing that. But what I wanted to do is give you an idea of what one of those looks like. I decided to pull one up that is by one of my mentors from my doctoral program. This is her and her sister wrote this. And I have no real, I literally just pulled this up right before I started recording, so that way I'd give you an idea of what you should be doing for this final paper. Now, obviously you would, take the time to make sure you really understand it, highlight it if you need to, jot some notes down if you want, because that's all you're really doing in the research article analysis and discussion, is just explaining what was the intent of the researchers, what methods did they use, what were the aims and goals of their research, what came out of it, what were the results, and maybe even just some of your own personal takeaways from it. And if you are using an article that you're going to use for your final paper, explain how it might be helpful or how it wasn't helpful. Anything like that would be great. So this article was in the Western Journal of Communication, volume 84, written by Karen A. Foss and Sonia K. Foss. An explication of visual enactment in advanced style, fashioning a challenge to the ideology of old age. So I read through this briefly. I didn't even get through the entire thing, but I myself, because when it comes to professors, most professors are very much skilled and knowledgeable in particular fields of study within their own discipline. So mine very much is in ethnography, sports communication, obviously leadership communication, things like that. There are some things that I'm not very familiar with, so I never even heard of enactment as a particular strategy or a type of theory that you can use. So for me, this is brand new, and for a lot of you all that are going through this process of picking an article, trying to get through it, because I know some of these articles can be pretty heavy, it can be a challenge, and this was a challenge for me too, because I never even heard of this before. But essentially what they are doing is, and I know Karen personally, her and her sister are very big into fashion and actually make a lot of their own clothing. So it makes sense that they would write a journal article on the idea of fashion and some of the ways you can challenge old concepts in fashion. And that's what they're doing, is they are making the argument that in this issue of Advanced Style, which is a magazine, that they took, in this issue, there was a photographer who took pictures of older people, both men and women, in various parts of the city in stylish clothing. And they're saying that actual process is in itself pushing back on some of the traditional ideas within fashion, right? That's what enactment is, now that I've read through this thing, is that not only are you making that argument, but the actual act of taking these pictures and putting them in a magazine is itself making the argument for, through the action of pushing against some of these norms within the fashion industry. So what they do here, they provide a lot of information, right? They explain what enactment is from the jump. The very first sentence, it explains what it is, what are the concepts behind it. They talk about some of the primary concepts of enactment, and then once they provide a pretty good understanding of what that is, they then get into advanced style. They give you some information on the magazine, what it's all about, a little bit about the photographer, and then they get into this idea of how clothing has been used as a form of resistance in the past. Now, you can already tell this is a little bit different than what we're doing for the final paper, but that's not something we're focused on right now. This is purely using this as an example for this research analysis and discussion. So they have a section on clothing as resistance. Then they get into this ideology of old age, right? So because you have to establish if someone is making an argument or if they're pushing back against a particular ideology, now you have to kind of explain what that ideology is and what it's all about. So they do a really good job talking about ageism, a number of different concepts about that. They cite obviously a ton of people to provide some information about that. And then they get into the actual argument of advanced style as visual enactment. So previously, at the very beginning of this, they talked about there's four main things or primary aspects of enactment. And so they take them on one by one. So they do visibility, and they provide some examples here. Eventually, they get into individuality, then synchronicity, and lastly, they talk about futurity. So they go into all of those things, and they're making their arguments here. This is a little bit different than the typical quantitative or qualitative types of methods that we've talked about previously so far in the class. This is more of a critique. This is more, they even explain that this is an essay versus a type of kind of a research paper. So they're making these arguments, but it is all intertwined it's grounded very much in theory, right? This theory of enactment, and they are using, basically their formula is, this is enactment, these are the four aspects or four parts of enactment, and now we're going to show you how this magazine issue applied these four concepts and is in the process of doing this enactment, this theory of enactment. And then they have their conclusion. So this is the type of article that you can use for your assignment. And this is, obviously this is a very quick way of going through it, but that's exactly what you would do, is you explain kind of in detail, not in detail, but you're reading this and you're explaining to someone who didn't get a chance to read it what it's all about and what are some of your major takeaways. So don't overthink it. The big thing, though, is make sure you are choosing a peer-reviewed journal article. So again, go into the Blackboard folder, the assignments resource folder, and there's a video that I have on there to show you how to access EBSCO and how to make sure that you're choosing a scholarly peer-reviewed journal article. Okay, now for your final paper. If you've taken classes with me before, because I've talked to students who took my sports leadership class, who took my leadership communication class, and the papers for those, or even my board of leadership class, the papers for those courses are very much the same, or at the very least similar. This paper is radically different, right? So if we want to use my dissertation as an example, I had my introduction talking about sports in general and the literature that's been talked about in sports, but also started explaining the fact that not only is sports important, but now it's feeding this brand new industry in fantasy football. And I gave a little bit of information about fantasy football. Then I got into the literature review. I talked about sports communication, then specifically talked about fantasy sports and some of the research that's been done there. But the fact that there was kind of a dearth of knowledge in terms of the constructing what the world of fantasy football sounds like in terms of the phrases and the words that are used in the industry. But I also had to, at some point, talk about how I was going to answer the questions that I came up with, right? So the literature review was that sports communication, fantasy research that's been done, and even a little bit on on metaphors, and ethnographies, because that's the theory that my paper was going to be grounded in. So that was my literature review. And then I, essentially through those first two sections, I came up with questions. The main question was, what are the means of speaking within the fantasy football industry? Right? So that's my research question. How am I going to answer that? So then I get to my methodology, and I explained that I was going to do a cluster analysis of, I believe it was 32 fantasy football podcasts. It was going to be two different podcasts, and it was going to be 16 episodes of each. I was going to go through, listen through, mark down any words and phrases that stuck out to me, any ones that were used frequently, and then do a cluster analysis where I start kind of putting them together based on themes that were emerging, and then from there I'd come up with major themes that were going to be a part of defining what these main phrases and themes within fantasy football are. That was my proposal, right? I didn't actually have to do that. So think about that when you're writing this final paper, when you're thinking about this final paper, is you use the introduction to lay down the problem or the issue. You use a literature review to then provide context for what research has been done before you, what some of the current research that's relevant to the work that you're doing. And then in that process, you're also coming up with either your research questions, your hypotheses, whatever it might be. And your methodology, you're explaining how are you going to answer that question, or how are you going to prove or disprove that hypothesis. Now, the benefit that you all have is you're not actually going to have to do that part of the work for this paper. This is just a proposal. You can make it as big or as little as you'd like. So for me, like I just explained, mine was about the cluster analysis with podcasting and yada, yada, yada. Now, we're not getting into the nitty gritty of a lot of the possible methods that are out there. What I plan on doing is, at some point this week or next week, is I'm gonna have one lecture that is completely dedicated to different types of approaches and tools that you can use in terms of the methodology, because I think that's the part where a lot of you all might be struggling. Because because there are a number of things that we've talked about in terms of quantitative analysis, but I think there are some other options that might be beneficial for you all if you want to do something like a qualitative analysis, maybe like a critical approach to your paper, or it might be a thematic analysis, or a rhetorical analysis, and I will explain to you all what those are, because that might work a little bit better, right? Because when it comes to research, there is a lot of work that's done, and a lot of people mostly consider the work that you do where you're interviewing someone, or you're handing out surveys to someone. But there's also, like we just saw with the Foss and the Foss article, where they are doing an analysis of a print text, or it could be of a movie, or it could be of a TV show, or it could be of a speech that's already been given. And you are conducting your own research, and your method is analyzing that particular text. So that's where this paper is a little bit different, whereas you're not actually going to prove anything. You're not going to actually enact that actual last part of the paper where you actually figure out and solve whatever it might be. You are just doing the proposal part of it. And so it's important that, and I'm pulling this up here, in Wallaman on page 152, they have an example of what a research proposal looks like. Now, the outline is just slightly different than what I'm requiring for this paper, but if it makes more sense to you to follow this template the way that it is, that is completely and totally fine, and it might be beneficial for you to type in academic research proposal and see what emerges and see what examples you might find. But if you want to follow the one here, that works. Just want to make sure this is clear. They'll have a section here where they talk about the aims of the research, and then they have this where it says comment. This section gives a briefest outline of the aims to explain the focus of the research to the reader and introduces some of the distinctive issues that will be involved. This is a comment to you to explain what this section is all about. So that way, when you start going through this process yourself, you know exactly what the focus of this section is and how yours might be a little bit different. Okay, but I highly suggest you check out this example, because it really will help you in terms of putting together yours. Because like I said, you're not having to reinvent the wheel here. Really, you can use this as a template and really just kind of apply your paper to this template. So I hope this answers some questions that may have come up with you all with regard to the 2 assignments that are coming up. But if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I've already had a couple students who let me know that my office hours don't work for them, and so we just found a different time to work or to meet via Zoom, or if you want to call me, whatever questions you might have about this paper. I know we're about halfway through the semester. I know some folks are going to start working on the final paper here pretty soon. So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.